Hello Horror Hounds, we are going to be looking at The Kiss of the Vampire. From 1963, Hammer Studios' third vampire film, their second attempt to make a vampire movie without Christopher Lee at the helm, and the first vampire movie of theirs that doesn't form part of their Dracula film franchise. Although in conception, this was intended to be Dracula 3 in essence. But not only have they lost Christopher Lee, they've also lost Peter Cushing from the cast. So I think it's fair to say that they're starting off on the back foot. So the only thing to do is raise a glass of appropriately red wine and wish them luck.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
The plot for The Kiss of the Vampire is exceedingly thin. An English honeymooning couple, Gerald and Marianne, are stranded in a small Bavarian town who are under the influence of a powerful family living in the castle above. They're vampires. The family run a vampire cult and kidnap Marianne to swell their ranks, so Gerald must join forces with Professor Zimmer, whose daughter had previously been abducted and vampirized, to destroy the cult and save Marianne. That is about all she wrote. So this film is not a sequel to Dracula, Horror of Dracula and The Brides of Dracula, but if you squint, you could argue that maybe it's a little bit of a sidequel. Van Helsing referred to the cult of the vampire in Horror of Dracula and The Brides of Dracula. How Baron Meinster from The Brides of Dracula was recruited by such a cult was alluded to in a few excellent lines of dialogue from Brides. But for the first time with Kiss, we actually get to meet such a vampire cult. So it's not too much of a leap of imagination to see the vampire shenanigans in The Kiss of the Vampire forming part of Dracula's network of satanic vampire cults that we've been told that he set up. We've just never seen it before. Running the cult, as usual, is an aristocratic family. Here the head of the family is Dr. Ravna, by far and away the least imposing head vampire we've seen so far. If people were upset in The Brides of Dracula that Baron Meinster's vampire wasn't Christopher Lee, I really doubt Dr. Ravna is going to fill those shoes for them. Much more interesting than Ravna is his offspring, his son Carl, played by Barry Warren, and his daughter Sabina, played by Jackie Wallace. Now this is the only credited feature film screen role of Jackie Wallace, which is a real pity because my eye was drawn to her a lot. She has definitely a way about her, and I was just waiting for Sabina to get something to do to see what Willis could actually bring to the table. It just kind of never happened. Carl, out of the two of them, gets all the juice because it's his role really to seduce and lure Marianne, this couple. One of the standout scenes of the entire movie is Carl's opening gambit to try and seduce Marianne. They're all sat in the castle's drawing room, and Carl is at the piano. Dr. Ravna tells him to play one of his own compositions, and he plays this moodily, weirdly sort of atonal, minor chordy thing that comes from his subconscious that clearly hypnotizes Marianne. I love stuff like this. It's really evocative and to me really played upon a scene I hold equally dear in Universal's House of Dracula. Now, just as The Kiss of the Vampire, Hammer's film, isn't that great a movie, Universal's House of Dracula also isn't that great a movie, but there is a scene where Dracula is seducing a woman who's playing at the piano, and as he sort of hypnotizes her and she starts to see the images from his world, and in his head the music she starts playing goes really weirdly atonal and minor chordy. There's just something so sublimely delicious about that. It works like gangbusters in House of Dracula, and it works like gangbusters in The Kiss of the Vampire. Kiss expands further upon some of the roads and paths hinted at in Brides by portraying vampirism as a social disease, expanding upon the idea of a growing cult-like circle of decadent, like-minded acolytes, and it certainly doubles down on the notion, springing from the fountainhead Dracula, of aristocrats feeding upon the proletariat. The proles here are represented in the main by the innkeepers who take in Gerald and Marianne. Certainly a strange, kooky, odd couple. If you've ever seen the fantastic UK TV series The League of Gentlemen, this has more than a whiff of The League of Gentlemen about it. If you haven't seen The League of Gentlemen, absolutely do yourself a favour. If you're a horror fan and you like comedy, who doesn't like laughing, find by any means necessary The League of Gentlemen and watch it from start to finish. Thank me later. But certainly the two innkeepers here in The Kiss of the Vampire have more than a whiff of the League about them. They're hiding something, they're quirky, very strange, something's definitely off with them, they're definitely out of kilter. There's a furtiveness about them, a fearfulness, a secretive quality. Are they in on it? Are they trying to protect themselves from it? There's a sense, once Marianne gets kidnapped and Gerald goes back to the inn and everyone says that, oh, you came alone, you've always been alone, you never came with a wife, that reminded me of a very similar sequence in Hostel, when you realise that when the penny drops and you realize, oh, the people that run the hostel are recruiting for the people that run the killing rooms. Shit, this spider's web is huge and they've always been in it. An awful lot of Kiss of the Vampire is played for mood and tone rather than shocks and sort of outre gore, and when it works well, certainly in the setup. Unfortunately, there's not so much of a payoff, but in the setup, when our couple arrive at the inn and there's something off kilter about it and the mood is not quite right, Bruno, who runs the inn, is very friendly, but it seems a little forced, whilst his wife can't keep up that facade so much. She's off in other rooms, very weepy and crying, looking at a photograph that she won't let anyone see. Something is most definitely up, and this sort of sense of eerie creepiness does work. And then Carl and Sabina come from the big castle and invite the couple up to dinner, and then later on to a masked ball, and certainly you know that the idea is that they're to be lured up there, and for what? The build-up works wonderfully, I think, all the way up to the masked ball, which is as lavish and gorgeous looking as you would expect from these Hammer movies. Certainly the masks, the more you see of the masks and the more twisted and phantasmagorical and demonic they get, the more you realise that, yeah, they really are in some deep, smelly stuff here, and they absolutely don't realise it. I just wish the film could have paid off all of that superb build-up. I just don't think it does. In the absence of Van Helsing and Peter Cushing, then, our vampire hunter here is Professor Zimmer, a man whose own daughter had been absorbed into the ranks of this vampiric cult. So he is definitely out for revenge. He's certainly much more flawed. He has much more feet of clay than Van Helsing ever did. He drinks, he's irascible. He doesn't even necessarily do much to help this young couple that he knows is in danger, because he's got his own game plan. He has to wait for a certain conjunction of planets so he can perform the satanic ritual to unleash some powers of hell to destroy this vampire cult, and that's what his real main focus is. This was an ending that was supposed to be used in the Brides of Dracula, but Peter Cushing, remember, said that Van Helsing would never call upon the powers of darkness to defeat vampirism, and he was quite right. But with Professor Zimmer, a much more flawed character, you can absolutely believe that he would do. So without that veneer of respectability and likability that Peter Cushing brings to the Van Helsing role, you really are exposing here with Professor Zimmer how conservative and patrician our heroes in these vampire movies really are. There's a strange tension in these Hammer vampire movies. The vampires represent a certain kind of liberation, whilst the good guys are the forces of the status quo, conservatism, the church, societal strictures of what women especially can and can't do. In this day and age, we really should watch these films and see them as the baddies. It's only the charm and grace that Cushing affords Van Helsing that makes us still kind of root for him. Professor Zimmer is another quality altogether. When he tells the story of how his daughter became embroiled in this, there really is no veneer to it. It's the story of a young woman who wanted to leave an oppressive patrician household and go off and have fun with her friends, and she gets into a spot of bother, and when she comes back she's diseased. I don't want to overplay too much the sexually liberating influence of the male vampires in these films. As much as they are freeing these frustrated and restricted women from the expectations of society which bind them, let's be honest, they only do so to either keep them prisoner or as a kind of perverse bride totem figure, or as members of a growing harem for themselves. The vampires aren't exactly right on. That Professor Zimmer turns to the dark arts to defeat his vampiric foes really, though, underlines for me the hypocrisy of these heroic characters. Zimmer says with no irony that a wooden cross will protect them as he sets about drawing an occult pentacle on the floor with which he intends to summon the forces of hell. I mean, this guy knows no shame and no sense of irony. The Van Helsings of this world can kill with impunity because they're saving souls, and they're recruiting helpers for their own cause, which of course is the cause of right, while the vampires do exactly the same thing. It's wrong. It would have been nice to get some kind of understanding as to what Zimmer's opposite, Ravner, and the vampire cult were all about. What was their philosophy? Were they all vampires, or were some of them willing human acolytes? Were some of them unwilling? Unfortunately, just as with Brides of Dracula, where the brides don't do anything really, so this vampire cult in Kiss of the Vampire is remarkably ineffectual. They are just there. The film would have played out exactly the same if it had just been the vampire family without this cult of disciples as well, which is a really unfortunate and missed opportunity. However, the film again looks absolutely gorgeous. Not Jack Asher's director of photography this time, but Alan Hume, who deserves a tip of the hat. He's clearly following the kind of lush template set down by Asher, beautifully lurid colours that give a sense of fairy tale rather than the naturalistic. It's certainly something Roger Corman used in his post-cycle of films, and something that Dario Argento would later go on to push to their absolute limits in films like Profondo Rosso, Suspiria and Inferno. The ending of the film, the swarm of hellbats summoned to take out the vampire cult, is just on paper sounded great, just too expensive for a Hammer film to pull off, I'm afraid. Just overreaching. There's a bit of trivia on the Internet Movie Database, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but it suggests that all the bats used in this final attack scene were bought from a local branch of Woolworths at the time, and boy does it show. Surely by now you would think that they would understand that these fake bats look ridiculous. It's not a case of this being a decades old film. They had to have looked ridiculous at the time. Compare the bat attack to the very similar effects used in The Birds that was released in the same year. Although, to give it its due, The Kiss of the Vampire was made in 1962. It was made before The Birds. But the effects of the attack are exactly the same. There are some models, and then there are some shots of bats and or birds sort of superimposed over the frame to make it look busier than it is. It's just that in the hands of Alfred Hitchcock, it works. It absolutely works. Which is a real shame because, and I know this is going to sound really damning, but you can see what they were going for. It aims for the kinky, and they almost pull it off. All of these bat attacks lead to the disciples flailing around, and whilst this film has been a lot more restrained than previous Hammer movies, and later, a lot more restrained than later Hammer movies, there is an attempt to get a bit of flesh on show. The disciples' gowns right up. It's an excuse to show, a bit of leg, a bit of décolletage. You've got the suckling bats attached to cleavage and the like, and they're going for the kinky, but it's just so ludicrously undercut by this absolutely cheap effect. I didn't thoroughly hate it. I know I'm giving that impression. It is a bit of a missed opportunity. It looks gorgeous. The acting is absolutely fine. It really could have done with a stronger lead vampire. The satanic cult, the vampire cult, should have done something. But as a tone piece, a sort of dark fairy tale, you know, when you're in the mood for some of those kinds of films, there are very few that you can turn to. This is one of them. I don't hate it, but I don't love it. It's fine. There will be a time where I'm in the mood for the kind of tone and feeling that The Kiss of the Vampire gives me, and I'll happily put it back on again. But if I'm ever in the mood for just a Hammer vampire movie, I won't be reaching first and foremost for The Kiss of the Vampire.